So here we are. So all our little plants that we sowed 3 weeks ago have germinated. They've come up, and even though we tried to sow them as thinly as possible, as you remember, they've come up far too thickly. And so the most difficult part for me of gardening is to thin out these plants. And the reason we do thin them is because they compete with each other for the nutrients in the soil, and the roots get all intertwined. And so instead of having individual plants, like say we have 7 plants here, we've got something like 30 plants, and they're all going to be competing with each other. So what we've got to do is thin out the less well-developed plants and allow the others to keep growing. So what we do is we determine the final spacing, which is going to be about 3 inches apart, and then we take out the plants around that 3-inch spacing. And next time you see it, and I always try to take out the smaller of the plants, because you know, the more well-developed ones are going to stand a better chance of creating a final plant that is in good shape. So what we're going to do is we're going to thin out this row and then thin out this row. So that's the next step. So here's a row of beets that we sowed before, and again we're going to try to space those at 3 inches apart. Sometimes I leave them a little closer and allow them to grow into a miniature beet and then harvest them. But if there are 2 beets that are very close together, I take the smallest one and allow the larger one of the 2 to grow. And so we end up with a nice little row of beets, all carefully thinned out. So. Okay, that's that one. Okay, so here is the mesclun mix that I sowed earlier, and in spite of my earnest efforts to have them all spaced equally, we've ended up with little patches where they're very thickly grown together, and then other patches where there's bare soil. So the way I thin in a situation like this is actually to do a combination of thinning and transplanting. So here we are. I get a clump of these little plants, and we've got about 5 or 10 plants, and we separate out the roots, and then we do the transplanting thing just like we did before, and put them in the spaces where there's space, so we get an evenly spaced set of transplants. So we end up with an even amount of plants throughout the area. And don't worry if some of your transplants don't quite make it. It's always a little bit traumatic for a plant to be moved from one place to another. But most of them will survive. Okay? So you remember last time we were sowing a catch crop of cool weather crops that do not mind cool soil temperatures, and so they can germinate. But the question is, how do we decide when it's time to sow our warm weather crops? Tomatoes, squash, zucchini, cucumber, they need warm soil in order to germinate. And so inside a growing dome, it's sometimes difficult to find a point in time where the soil is warm enough. So what I do, and usually it's at the end of March or the beginning of April, what I do is I keep a sharp eye out on the plants themselves, and lo and behold, here we have a little tomato plant that has decided that it is warm enough to germinate. So as soon as I see these little tomato plants that are self-germinated, I know it's time to sow the warm weather crops.